The story of the Hargraves children didn't begin with a scream, a radio call, or even a whisper. It began with a quiet February sunrise in 1975, when the frost clung to the trees of Hargraves woods like thin sheets of glass. The woods had always been still, unnervingly still, but that morning they seemed to breathe, releasing curls of mist from the earth as if exhaling after a long, dreamless sleep. Two hunters cut through the haze, boots crunching on frozen ground, unaware that every step pulled them deeper into a place that had not welcomed strangers for decades. They saw the cabin only when the fog thinned enough for its outline to appear, crooked and slumped, as though the forest had tried to swallow it whole. It wasn't on any map, and the hunters, both lifelong locals, swore they'd never seen it before. A faint sound leaked through its warped walls, a rhythm, like someone softly tapping wood from the inside. One hunter called out. The tapping stopped. And then, slowly, the door eased open. 4 children stood in the doorway. Barefoot. Expressionless. Their clothes were ragged and grey with dirt, their skin pale as though they'd never seen sunlight. Not one of them spoke. Not one cried. They simply watched the men with wide, unblinking eyes, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. The youngest held a piece of twine tightly wound around their fingers, tugging it rhythmically, the way someone might pull the string on a broken music box. The hunters asked where their parents were, but the children only stepped forward in unison, silent as snowfall. And though the air was painfully cold, sweat began to bead down the hunters' backs because something in the gloom behind the children shifted, as though a second figure had been standing there the entire time. Watching. Breathing. Waiting. When the hunters led the children away from the cabin, the woods seemed to close behind them. And by the time authorities returned that afternoon, the sound had started again, soft tapping, coming from deep in the trees. It echoed just once, then vanished. Key point number 1 in 450 words, without subheadings and without an ending sentence. The discovery of the Hargraves children in 1975 began as nothing more than an early morning hunting trip that 2 men from the nearby town had taken dozens of times before. The forest was familiar to them, its winding paths, its frozen streams, the way the fog sat low on winter mornings like a heavy curtain across the ground. They knew every patch of moss, every broken tree limb, every odd echo that sometimes drifted through the dense woods. But that morning, as they moved deeper into the quiet stretch known locally as Hargraves Woods, something felt noticeably different. The air hung unnaturally still, and even the birds, usually awake and restless at dawn, seemed to be hiding high in the branches. It was the kind of silence that made the men lower their voices without thinking, as if the forest itself might overhear them. It was around the time the sun began pushing pale beams of light through the fog that they saw the cabin. At first, it appeared only as a dark shape pressed against the trees, easily mistaken for an abandoned shed or an old root cellar. But the longer they looked at it, the clearer it became that this was a structure neither of them had ever come across before, even though they had walked this very route for years. The walls were rough, weathered, and strangely sunken, as though built by someone who had no intention of being found or noticed. One of the hunters felt a prickling up the back of his neck as they approached, an instinctive warning he couldn't explain. They would later argue about who heard the sound first. A faint tapping, almost polite, like someone knocking from somewhere inside the cabin. The kind of sound that doesn't immediately register as human because it's too slow, too steady, too calm. The men froze, listening. When it came again, 3 soft taps, a pause, then 2 more, they exchanged uneasy glances. People did not live out here. Not families. Not drifters. No one. Still, one of them called out, his voice cracking the silence. The tapping stopped at once, sharp and absolute. A few seconds stretched painfully long as the men waited for any reply. Instead, the door creaked open by itself, revealing 4 children standing in a narrow line. Their faces were pale, their expressions blank, their clothing in tatters stiffened by dirt and cold. They did not look afraid or relieved or curious. They simply stood there, staring at the hunters as if they had been expecting them all along, as though the men had unknowingly stepped into a moment that had been rehearsed for days or weeks or perhaps far longer than that. For several days after their discovery, the Hargraves children remained locked in a disturbing, impenetrable silence that unsettled everyone who tried to speak with them. Doctors, social workers, deputies, Even a soft-voiced nurse who specialized in traumatized children all attempted to coax out a single word, but nothing came. They responded to questions with vacant stares or subtle movements of their hands, communicating as though language itself had been taken away from them or deliberately forbidden. What struck people the most was not just their refusal to talk, but the synchronized manner in which they acted. If one child turned their head, the others followed. If one shifted in their seat, the rest mirrored the movement with eerie precision, as though they shared an unspoken understanding that no one else could access. During routine examinations, doctors noted that none of the children displayed the usual signs of shock one might expect from those rescued from isolation or neglect. Their heart rates remained steady, their breathing calm, their expressions unnervingly neutral. It was as if they had practiced how to behave in the presence of outsiders. At mealtimes, they ate methodically and quietly, glancing at each other between bites as though waiting for signals only they knew how to interpret. Whenever one of them lifted a spoon or drank water, the others performed the same action seconds later, producing an unsettling rhythm that unsettled even the most experienced staff members. No matter what environment they were placed in, they stayed close, rarely more than an arm's length apart, always moving in a protective cluster. Investigators grew increasingly frustrated as days passed without any progress. They could not confirm their identities, ages, or how long they had been in the woods. Efforts to separate the children, even briefly, triggered immediate panic, not loud or chaotic, but a silent, frozen terror that gripped them all simultaneously. The moment one child was led toward another room, the remaining three would stiffen, eyes widening in perfect unison, bodies trembling as though bracing for something dreadful. Staff began documenting these reactions because they occurred with such precise consistency that it became impossible to view them as coincidence. What disturbed authorities most was the strange set of gestures the children repeatedly used among themselves. A tap on the wrist, a circle drawn with a fingertip on the table, a faint tug at an invisible thread in the air. These actions seemed to function as a language more comfortable to them than speech. There were moments when one of the younger children appeared ready to speak, lips parting, throat tightening only for the eldest to glance sharply at them, issuing a small, controlled gesture that immediately silenced the attempt. Observers could not tell whether this dynamic came from fear, habit, or some rigid rule they had been forced to obey for years. The mystery of the Hargraves parents began to unravel almost immediately after the children were discovered, and what investigators found, or rather, did not find, deepened the sense of unease surrounding the case. Authorities began by retracing the family's known addresses, checking records, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen or heard from them in recent years. The trail, however, quickly grew cold. The family home, supposedly maintained for decades, had been reduced to smoldering ruins long before anyone had reported the children missing. Fire reports confirmed a blaze had consumed the house several months prior, but the most chilling aspect was the absence of human remains. Not a single trace of the Hargraves parents could be located, no ashes, no bones, nothing that would explain how an entire household had vanished. Neighbors recalled hearing odd noises around the property in the months before the fire, strange thumping at night, whispers carried on the wind, sometimes laughter that ended abruptly. Yet no one had seen anyone entering or leaving the house. Some locals mentioned glimpsing the children alone in the yard, pale and still, sometimes standing silently by the edge of the forest as if guarding the land. Authorities tried to reconcile these accounts with the fire, but the timeline seemed impossible. How could 4 small children survive for months in isolation without the presence of adult caretakers, and why had no one intervened? Detectives scoured the surrounding woods, combing through underbrush, hollow logs, and abandoned cabins. They found remnants of makeshift shelters, scraps of clothing, and rudimentary furniture, suggesting that the children or someone else had lived in the woods for an extended period. Despite these discoveries, no clues pointed toward the whereabouts of the parents. Every interview, every lead, seemed to circle back to the same disquieting reality. The Hargraves family had disappeared entirely, leaving the children behind. Law enforcement began to question whether the fire had been accidental or deliberate. Could someone have wanted to erase the family entirely? And if so, why leave the children alive, hidden within the forest? The absence of the parents sparked not only investigative but also psychological questions. How had the children survived without adult guidance, food, or basic protection? Were they being kept in captivity, or had they been self-sufficient in some way that defied conventional understanding? Even experts in child welfare and criminal behavior found themselves unsettled by the notion that these children had endured months of solitude without leaving the woods or seeking help, their survival marked by an eerie calm and unnatural coordination. The missing parents became more than a simple clue, they were a looming presence in the investigation, a puzzle piece that refused to fit and cast a shadow over every subsequent step in understanding the children's ordeal, leaving authorities to wonder if they had stumbled upon not just an isolated tragedy, but a story that carried secrets far beyond anything they had imagined. Amid the confusion surrounding the Hargraves children, it was the discovery of a hidden diary that added a layer of incomprehensible depth to their story. During a careful search of the cabin's floorboards, investigators lifted a loose plank and found a small, leather-bound notebook, yellowed and brittle with age, tucked away in a secret cavity. The eldest child, when shown the notebook, did not resist its removal but instead watched silently, eyes narrowing in something that resembled apprehension, as though even acknowledging its existence carried consequences. The notebook was filled with cramped handwriting, sometimes barely legible, the letters looping and angular in a pattern that suggested both haste and ritualistic precision. It became immediately clear that it had not been written for anyone else's eyes. The words were fragmented, coded, and often terrifying in implication. The diary contained entries spanning months, though the timeline was irregular, sometimes leaping forward days or weeks without explanation. The content was unsettling in its focus: rules, warnings, and repeated references to an entity the children called the Nighttime Man. The eldest child had chronicled their days with meticulous care, detailing when meals were taken, when the others were allowed to sleep, and when they were instructed to perform strange, precise movements. There were descriptions of punishments, harsh and mysterious, that had been administered for failing to adhere to invisible guidelines, and the tone suggested a deep fear that went beyond normal childhood apprehension. One passage described a rule about never speaking of certain things, never leaving the cabin alone, and always obeying commands issued in whispers. The words were not just instructions, they carried an air of ritual, as if the children were part of something much older and more dangerous than a typical household. Scattered among these rules were cryptic sketches, symbols etched across the margins, small human figures contorted into unnatural positions, and circles drawn around certain phrases as if to emphasize their importance. These drawings mirrored markings later discovered on the children's bodies, which added a physical dimension to the psychological torment recorded in the diary. Investigators speculated that the symbols and rules were part of a belief system or set of instructions enforced by someone who had remained unseen for months, shaping the children's behavior in ways that defied conventional understanding. Every entry hinted at tension and vigilance, a life lived under constant supervision and strict regulation, but there were also moments of defiance, a small flourish of a drawing, a word written in a corner that hinted at imagination surviving within the boundaries of fear. The presence of the diary confirmed what had been suspected but not yet understood. The children were not merely abandoned, they had been trained, conditioned, and disciplined within the confines of the woods. It became a silent witness to a life of control and secrecy, offering glimpses into a reality that was both horrifying and meticulously organized, a reality that the authorities could observe but could not fully comprehend. As the investigation into the Hargraves children deepened, the surrounding woods began to assert themselves in ways that unsettled even the most experienced officers. Deputies assigned to patrol the perimeter of the area reported sensations that were impossible to ignore, footsteps that seemed to follow them, whispers that drifted through the trees in no discernible direction, and shadows that moved just beyond the edge of vision. Initially, these phenomena were dismissed as products of exhaustion, stress, or overactive imaginations, but their persistence could not be ignored. Multiple officers, walking different routes at different times, recounted hearing the same low murmurs and soft rustling that seemed to respond to their presence. When one deputy paused, the sounds would stop, only to resume moments later when movement continued, as though the forest itself were aware of their actions and deliberately testing boundaries. The whispers were never coherent, more like fragments of words or elongated syllables, carried on the wind so faintly that it was impossible to trace their source. Occasionally, a single word, leave, don't, or watch, would emerge from the murmurs, chilling in its clarity against the otherwise indecipherable background. Officers reported a compulsion to follow the sound, as though the forest were luring them deeper into a labyrinth of trees and shadows, but those who resisted found the feeling lingered, a gnawing unease that settled in their chests. Even during daylight, the woods seemed to stretch and shift, paths appearing narrower, clearings seeming to vanish when looked at directly, creating an almost hallucinatory effect that left investigators questioning what they had actually seen. The phenomena were not limited to auditory and visual disturbances. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that defied explanation. Radios crackled with static even in strong reception areas, compasses wavered and spun without cause, and flashlights would dim or flicker as if the shadows themselves were absorbing light. Officers who returned to the area after the initial discovery reported a sense of being watched, an almost physical pressure on their backs and shoulders, as if the forest bore silent witness to their presence. Animals normally abundant in the woods had vanished entirely, replaced by an unnatural quiet that made every step feel louder, every breath more intrusive. Local residents reinforced these accounts with stories of previous visitors who had gone missing or fled, claiming that the forest was alive in some way, responding to intrusions with subtle, terrifying signals. The investigation increasingly revealed that the woods were more than a setting for the children's concealment, they were an active participant in the mystery, a space that seemed to enforce rules, manipulate perception, and guard secrets far beyond what any human authority could control. Every step into the Hargraves woods carried the weight of vigilance, as if the very trees were watching, waiting, and remembering every intrusion with deliberate intent. When the children were brought into the care of authorities and examined by doctors, it quickly became apparent that their bodies bore evidence of something far more disturbing than mere neglect or exposure to the elements. During routine medical checks, practitioners discovered identical symbols etched into the ankles of each child, precise and deliberate markings that could not have been accidental. The designs were geometric yet obscure, a series of interconnected lines and small circles forming patterns that suggested ritual or instruction rather than decoration. What was immediately unsettling was the uniformity. Each child carried the same symbols in the exact same locations, as though these marks were not merely symbolic but served a function known only to those who had imposed them. Attempts to trace the origins of the designs, consulting folklore experts, historians, and even anthropologists, yielded no clear reference. Nothing in documented ritual, cultural practice, or known secret societies matched what was found on the Hargraves children. The marks themselves were fresh enough to suggest they had been applied not long before the children were discovered, yet there were no signs of infection or medical intervention, indicating that whoever had placed them had a knowledge of technique that minimized harm while leaving permanent impressions. When asked to explain the markings, the children refused, their silence unbroken by medical questioning or gentle coaxing. It was as if the marks were an unspoken law, a boundary that must not be crossed. Even those trained to work with traumatized children were unsettled by the intensity of the children's response when the symbols were examined. Subtle flinches, rigid postures, and barely perceptible exchanges of glances hinted at a shared understanding, a silent communication that conveyed both fear and obedience. Investigators began to consider the possibility that the markings were a form of control, a coded language imposed on the children to regulate behavior, much like the rules and instructions later revealed in the hidden diary. Each line and circle could represent a warning, a command, or an indicator of transgression, creating a system that functioned without words. Experts speculated that the markings might have been part of a larger pattern of psychological conditioning, designed to reinforce submission and synchronize the children's actions, tying their physical bodies to an unseen authority. As more examinations were conducted, authorities noted that the children occasionally traced the designs with their fingers in moments of thought or hesitation, almost unconsciously, as if seeking guidance from the symbols themselves. The markings were no longer just scars or carvings, they were a language, a map of invisible rules, and a lingering testament to the unseen force that had dominated the children's lives for months, binding them together in a shared experience that was both physical and psychological, impossible to separate or fully understand. On the fifth night after the Hargraves children had been placed in a temporary foster home under the watchful eyes of authorities, the calm that had characterized their early days of care was shattered in a way that defied explanation. The youngest child, a boy of perhaps 5 or 6, disappeared from a locked room where he had been resting quietly with the eldest child seated nearby. The door had been secured, the windows latched, and yet by the time a caretaker returned to check on them, the room was empty, as if he had evaporated into thin air. Panic immediately set in among the staff, security protocols were doubled, search teams were mobilized, and deputies combed the immediate vicinity. Despite every effort, there were no tracks in the snow outside, no signs of forced entry, and no noise that could indicate movement. It was as if the child had simply stepped out of reality and reappeared elsewhere. Hours passed before he was found, not in a neighboring building or along the main paths, but sitting at the very edge of the woods that had once concealed the family's secret cabin. He was calm, eerily so, almost as though he had been waiting there for someone to notice. His expression was blank, his posture still, and he did not answer questions or respond to gentle calls. He had returned, yet his presence seemed to radiate a sense of otherness that unsettled the adults around him. Officers and caretakers struggled to reconcile the innocence of his age with the intensity of the aura he projected, an unsettling combination of vulnerability and unspoken knowledge that suggested experiences far beyond his years. When investigators spoke with the eldest child afterward, she made only a single gesture, an almost imperceptible tilt of her head toward the forest, and that was enough to convey a warning or an explanation that words could not capture. It became clear that the children maintained an intimate, almost symbiotic connection with the woods themselves, and that their actions were governed by forces unseen to outsiders. The youngest boy's disappearance was not random, it was deliberate, perhaps even guided by something or someone that still lingered in the trees, observing, waiting, and shaping events according to rules that defied adult comprehension. The incident left authorities questioning the boundaries of control the children had been subject to while in the woods. The woods were not merely a backdrop to their isolation, they had been a participant, a presence capable of influencing behavior in ways that could not be explained by standard psychology. Every caretaker, deputy, and investigator who witnessed the child sitting silently at the edge of the forest sensed that they were observing not just a missing boy, but a fragment of a larger, living enigma. It was as though the forest had claimed him temporarily, testing, guiding, or perhaps rewarding a compliance that the adults could neither enforce nor understand, and the event marked the first unmistakable sign that the children's connection to their former world was not entirely severed, and that the rules governing their lives were far more complex than anyone had anticipated. During a meticulous search of the Hargraves cabin, investigators stumbled upon a tape recorder hidden beneath a loose floorboard, its exterior coated in years of dust and grime. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, the kind of old, mechanical device that might have been left behind by chance. But when the tape was played, it revealed something entirely unexpected, a recording that defied any reasonable explanation and immediately unsettled everyone in the room. The sound was distorted and intermittent, a low, guttural hum underlying the static, punctuated by rhythmic tapping that echoed through the speakers with uncanny precision. It was unlike anything captured in conventional recordings, as though the device had preserved not just sound but the very atmosphere of the cabin itself. The rhythm was unnerving, a deliberate cadence that seemed almost ritualistic, tapping out a pattern that was both familiar and alien, like a heartbeat slowed and warped in the shadows. Between the tapping, a breathy voice emerged, counting down from 10 in uneven, rasping tones that fluctuated in pitch and speed. The voice was human enough to be recognizable, yet distorted in a way that made it nearly impossible to discern whether it belonged to an adult or a child. There were pauses between numbers, long and heavy, filled with a tension that made listeners instinctively lean closer to hear what might come next. It was as though the cabin itself had recorded not only actions but intent, embedding in the tape a sense of expectation, fear, and ritualized control that went far beyond simple observation. Forensic audio experts later confirmed that the recording showed no signs of tampering, and yet it contained phenomena that could not be reproduced under normal conditions. The tapping did not correspond to any mechanical function of the device, nor did it match typical percussive sounds. It was alive in a way, vibrating with energy that seemed to resonate through the floors and walls of the cabin. The counting voice appeared deliberate, a mechanism of control or anticipation, and when investigators attempted to analyze it for patterns, they realized the numbers did not merely decrease, they built a rhythm that mirrored the children's movements and gestures, suggesting a direct connection between the sounds and the behaviors recorded elsewhere in the investigation. When the eldest child was presented with the tape, she displayed the same controlled, unreadable reaction that had been observed in other contexts. She did not acknowledge it verbally, but her gaze and subtle movements implied recognition, a response that hinted at the recording's origin and purpose. The tape, silent to outsiders in meaning but filled with coded authority for those who had lived within the cabin, revealed that the children had not simply been hidden, they had been subjected to a structured, psychological system reinforced by sound, rhythm, and unspoken command, a system that had persisted long enough to imprint itself indelibly on their memory and behavior, leaving investigators to confront a form of influence that was as invisible as it was absolute. After weeks of investigation and numerous returns to the site, authorities decided it was necessary to revisit the Hargraves cabin itself, hoping to find further clues that might explain the children's ordeal. The team arrived on a cold morning, the fog rolling low over the forest floor, carrying an almost unnatural stillness. They approached the site with caution, noting the familiar outline of the cabin through the trees, or so they thought. What met them was something that defied expectation and reason. The cabin was gone. Not abandoned, not decayed, but utterly destroyed, as if some immense force had compressed it, crushed it, or otherwise erased it from the landscape. Where warped wooden walls and a slanted roof had once stood, there were now only splintered fragments and scorched earth, scattered in a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. The surrounding trees bore the marks of immense pressure, limbs broken and bark stripped, yet no machinery, fire, or natural event could account for the precise devastation. Investigators combed the area thoroughly, searching for remnants of furniture, personal belongings, or any trace of the children's previous life within the cabin. All that remained were fragmented shards of wood, an old tin plate, and scorched scraps of cloth, items so small and scattered that they offered no real explanation for what had occurred. Officers reported a heavy, oppressive silence hanging over the site, a silence that was different from the forest's natural quiet. It felt deliberate, as if the air itself had been compressed in mourning or warning. Some members of the team described an almost physical sensation of watching eyes, an instinctive awareness that the destruction had been more than structural, it had been purposeful, as if the cabin itself had been guarding a secret and only revealed it in destruction. Even the ground seemed altered. Where one would expect depressions from burned or broken foundations, the soil was unnaturally leveled, flattened in patterns that suggested something or someone had exerted immense control over the environment. Footprints, animal tracks, and signs of human activity were absent. It was as though the cabin had never existed, erased entirely by forces that could not be measured or explained. This left investigators uneasy, not only because they had lost a critical site of evidence but because the event seemed to reinforce a recurring pattern. The children had existed within a world governed by rules that adults could not see, a reality where human understanding was subordinate to unseen authority. Returning from the site, officers could not shake the feeling that they had not simply witnessed destruction but had intruded on an event that was ongoing, something larger and more active than a typical crime scene. The obliteration of the cabin suggested that the secrets held within it, rituals, recordings, markings, and perhaps the invisible rules imposed on the children, were never meant to be uncovered. Whatever force or influence had governed the Hargraves children was still present in the woods, waiting, observing, and ensuring that its mysteries remained intact even after human intervention had attempted to uncover them. It was only after weeks of careful observation and repeated attempts at communication that the eldest Hargraves child finally spoke, breaking a silence that had persisted since their discovery. The words were sparse, deliberate, and chilling in their clarity, as if each syllable had been weighed against some invisible rule before it left her lips. She revealed that the hunters who had rescued them were not saviors in the sense anyone had imagined. Their arrival had interrupted a sequence of events that had been carefully orchestrated within the woods, a pattern that the children had been trained to follow for months or perhaps years. According to her, the forest itself was part of this system, a silent, vigilant presence that governed every movement, every gesture, and every breath. The children had existed within a framework so strict that human intervention, no matter how well-meaning, could destabilize the delicate balance that had been maintained. Her account described rules and rituals that seemed impossible for outsiders to comprehend. She spoke of precise schedules, of signals passed between the children that dictated when they could eat, move, or speak, and of punishments that followed any deviation with swift, almost mechanical enforcement. The nighttime man she referenced in her diary had not been a singular person but an embodiment of the authority imposed by the forest and the unseen overseers who had trained them. Every action, every movement was part of a larger system, a structure designed to preserve order and obedience, and the hunters had unknowingly breached it simply by stepping into the clearing. The children's lives had been shaped not by neglect alone, but by a meticulously enforced hierarchy that blurred the line between nurture and control, reality and ritual. As she continued, it became evident that her revelation was more than just information, it was a warning. She implied that the children were not passive victims, and that their survival had depended on strict adherence to rules that outsiders could neither understand nor enforce. The hunters had interrupted something that was meant to continue, a sequence whose significance went beyond mere daily survival. The forest had reacted to their intrusion, the boundaries had shifted, and the children's behavior had adapted accordingly, signaling a system still alive and aware. Authorities struggled to reconcile this account with everything else they had observed: the symbols on the children's bodies, the hidden diary, the audio recordings, and the mysterious phenomena within the woods. Each element suggested a life governed by invisible rules, a network of control and observation that was far beyond conventional explanation. The eldest child's words transformed the narrative entirely, revealing that the rescue was not the end of the nightmare, but merely a disruption in a structure far older and more complex than anyone could have anticipated, and the true scope of what had been interrupted remained terrifyingly unknown.